Tirou do... Pode começar? Bom, é um prazer estar aqui, trazer a Kate e o Will, né? A Kate, Lloyd Thomas, o Will Thomson. Eles são colegas no projeto Traduzindo Ferro, Transformando Conhecimento em Arquitetura, Projeto e Design... arquitetura, eu sempre confundo. Projeto, Arquitetura e Trabalho. É um projeto que a gente vem conduzindo, né, conjuntamente. Eu e Kate somos os principais investigadores aqui, né, os PIs. O Will e a Lara, que estão aqui com a gente, né, eles são, respectivamente, associados aqui a gente, né, contribuem aqui com o trabalho nosso. Nós constituímos o Fantastic Four. A Kate ontem trouxe uma camiseta para nós 4. Enfim, é o núcleo que basicamente está coordenando e organizando as atividades aqui do projeto, juntamente com o restante do core team, né, que é composto, né, por outros tantos pesquisadores, professores, docentes, tanto de Newcastle como daqui de São Paulo, de São Carlos. Bom, a gente conta aqui também com a presença do Carlos, né, que é um advisory board, né, um conselho consultivo do projeto, né, e com Caia, Raíssa e mais alguém, Caia e Raíssa, que fazem parte dos affiliated researchers, né, são pesquisadores associados, né, estão acompanhando aqui também os trabalhos. Bom, a gente convidou a Kate, né, a gente tem um evento que vai começar na segunda-feira da semana que vem, né, com a presença, inclusive, do professor Sérgio Ferro. Na terça-feira, ele vai estar fazendo uma palestra. Lúcia, muito obrigado, vai participar como debatedora e comentadora, né? A gente vai ter a oportunidade de ouvir o Sérgio e depois levantar algumas questões para ele, né, por intermédio da Lúcia. Esse evento, né, que acontece a semana que vem, né, é talvez o penúltimo grande evento do projeto, né, onde a gente vai reunir todos os pesquisadores afiliados, são mais de 30, né, são em torno de 30, são 30 e... Fala o número para mim que eu já não sei mais. 35 pesquisadores, né, juntos, né, produzindo, né, o que a gente tem chamado, né, de estudos de produção, que tomam, né, particularmente, a produção na arquitetura, né, como objeto. A produção material, né, a produção a partir da aplicação, né, do trabalho, que, segundo Marx, e relembrado sempre pelo Sérgio Ferro, é a única atividade que produz efetivamente valor. Esse seminário ele vai ser dividido, né, em duas partes, tem uma parte pública e uma parte mais privada do próprio projeto. A gente começa com uma parte mais privada, na segunda-feira, onde a gente vai discutir alguns encaminhamentos de planejamento nossos internos. Na terça-feira, a gente começa, né, com as sessões públicas, né, de discussão em 6 temáticas diferentes, né, a respeito do que vem sendo trabalhado nesses tais estudos de produção. E no último dia, né, novamente, uma parte privada, né, do projeto, para a gente planejar, né, o evento que vai acontecer o ano que vem em Newcastle, 2024, né, muito provavelmente em março, né, de 2024, estamos estudando aqui as datas, e, enfim, é com muito prazer que a gente vem ouvir, né, a Kate e o Will, a gente os convidou, né, para justamente, né, contar um pouco do qual que tem sido o impacto, né, dessa nova alternativa, né, de pensar, né, o que se produz na arquitetura, tá, a partir do processo de trabalho, né, do processo material de constituição dessa arquitetura. Como diz a Kate, da Industries of Architecture.
Okay, so I'll make a really brief translation for the YouTube people. hello to people watching. And Joan was just welcoming Katie and Will, so thank you very much for being here. And he was talking a little bit of the project that we have the ongoing for, I think, 2 years now, since 2020, the TFTK, so translating Ferro, transforming knowledge in design, building, architecture, and labor. Yeah, and yeah. So next week we'll have this bigger event, the symposium in São Paulo, where Lucia is going to be one of the respondents. I mean, the respondent of Sérgio Ferro's lecture on Wednesday. I think it's Wednesday or Tuesday. Tuesday, 4 of April. So you're all invited to come. And of course, we have the whole core team with us. Here we have Raissa and Kaya that are associated researchers with us. Hello, thank you for coming. And also the core team members, we have Pedro Arantes, Silke Kapp, Matt Davis, and Zalira. And Giovanna is one of the TTs. She's helping a lot. And what else? Mari Moura, yes, sorry, Mari. And yeah, what else I should translate for the whole part of what you just said? So yeah, now I'll leave it to Katie that will give her lecture in English. So you're here to practice your English. Thank you very much. And that's it.
Okay. Thank you very much, João Marcos, for the introduction and also for the making us so welcome here and for being able to be finally in San Carlos. And thank you so much as well so far to Lara and Raissa for making our stay already wonderful. And we feel very, very pleased to be here at last. And it's so good to see, he's Carlos Martins and Kaya, who we already know, and to meet the rest of you as well. So I've got so many different things here to press. So I think João's already explained to you that a little bit about the project. So you know kind of why Will and I are here and how we're involved. And here's some of the core team that we mentioned. Just also to see here the familiar faces of João and myself in the core team. And the way we weren't quite sure about the audience today. We didn't know who would be coming. And we were asked to present kind of production studies in Sérgio Ferro in the UK. So we're going to try that. We've got 5 parts now. It was 4 before. 5 parts. So just I'll say a little bit about the beginnings of the project, at least from my point of view, because many of you were already very familiar with Sérgio Ferro for a long time. And then talk a little bit about the translation aspects of the project and translating some of Ferro's works. And then I really want to open it out and think about how Ferro's work is acting as a catalyst for developing this field of production studies. And especially what does that mean when we translate it into not just the UK context, but beyond Brazil and the places which have already been discussing what Ferro's work might mean. And then Will's going to take over and talk about some of the work we've been doing trying to teach production studies, just very early steps, because this is something we need to see in architecture schools, and we're not seeing it much yet. And then we've got a couple of examples around how we work with Ferro's ideas and production studies in our own research. And apologies to some of you who'll be there next week. You'll see some of this again. So, okay. Oh, that's not going to work. This one. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, but for me, the encounter with Sérgio Ferro's work and also with a number of people who are still involved in the project happened at a conference, I think in 2012, a construction history conference. Silke was there, Felipe Contier was there, Renato, Ana Paula Cury, various people. And it was watching Felipe Contier's lecture about Artigas and talking to Felipe and Ana Paula afterwards, where they started to talk about Sérgio Ferro's work. And then we went for an amazing lunch and met lots of people. And this is kind of at the beginning, I think, of the relationships that are in this project. And we invited, with a lot of help from other people, we invited Sérgio to be the keynote speaker at a conference, I think, which Joanne mentioned, in Newcastle in 2014, which is where we're both based, called Industries of Architecture. And once again, I think there's probably, again, perhaps because Sérgio was supposed to be giving the keynote, in the end, he wasn't able to visit. He's still never actually been to the UK in person. We hope that will change next year. It drew a group of Brazilian researchers to the conference, including João Marcos, so that's where we met for the first time. And it's really at that conference, I can't tell you how much excitement there was. We just read Sérgio's paper at the conference, but it changed the direction of the conversation altogether. And I think there was really a shock from the kind of, from the audience to start thinking about architecture, if you like, as a kind of somehow the servant of capitalism. I mean, this was a kind of, I think it was it just almost sent shockwaves, I think, through our event. So we started working together, Silke Cap, myself and João, and Felipe Conche, and we translated, first of all, for the book of the conference, a text, an introduction to Dessin Chantier, the paper which Sérgio gave at Industries of Architecture, and also Concrete as Weapon in Harvard Design magazine. And while that was all happening, we started to talk about putting this project together. And it was in those conversations that we started to talk about why translate Sérgio Ferro's work. That's one step, but that what we wanted to do is use it to build some kind of field called production studies. And I think it's really important just to say something about this, that so the project isn't only about translating Ferro's work with all the kind of questions that brings, but it really is about transforming knowledge, especially around building a much greater awareness of the relations between construction labor and design, something which is hardly taught to architecture students. I mean, literally the building site or construction work is hardly taught to architecture students, let alone even discussed in architectural discourse. And I suppose it's what building that kind of set of questions would be is how we understand production studies. And we're looking at it as something we build collectively with a group of researchers. And I guess that's what we're making some progress with. So we're translating, Silke Cap leads the translation team. We're translating 3 key works from Sérgio Ferro, the building site and the design, the construction of classical design, and then a collection of various texts from Sérgio in an anthology, which will probably be called Architecture from Below. Not decided fully yet. And we hope that the anthology will be out for the conference in 2024, which João Marcos mentioned. But as well as translating these works, we've been really interested in trying to develop a kind of an audience, a group who want to talk about Ferro's work and think about it, as well as a kind of consultancy group for the translators. Sometimes we have a monthly reading group, one in English and one in Portuguese. Often it's a lot more people than you're seeing on the screen, and it's been a kind of a real core of people, but also people dropping in and out as the project's been progressing. And that's been, for me, one of the most, really thrilling parts of the project. And in February last year, the core team came from Brazil to the UK and met with some of the UK affiliated researchers, and we talked about Ferro's work and the kind of responses that we were having to it. So that was quite a small, closed event in William Morris Gallery. And at that event, we also had the first kind of a public lecture on Zoom from Sérgio Ferro at Central St. Martin's, which is a London-based art and design school who are kind of partners on the project. We've been working quite closely with them. And I mean, I just sort of, I think about, it was Sean Griffiths actually, but someone, kind of a key kind of professor and designer in the UK who tuned into this lecture and said, like so many do, confronting Ferro's work for the first time, that this was completely sort of transformative for him and how he thought about architecture. He's since, I'm glad to say, become a very active union worker. So part of the question about translating Ferro's work is not only the literal translation, but thinking about how concepts which have been developed in the contexts where Sérgio was based, so in Brazil, and often then developed in the research in Brazil, by researchers in Brazil, how they might translate into the UK and into international contexts. And particularly, I suppose, in the UK, where there's almost entirely it's sort of mainstream building, very little kind of self-building or informal building takes place at all. So we've started to become familiar with the research of the Brazilian side researchers. So the core team also went to Sao Paulo around this time last year to learn about the affiliated researchers' work and to make some visits to Usina's buildings, to Sérgio Ferro's Boris Fausto house and the Dino Zamatro house as well. So this gave us kind of more of an understanding of the kind of questions and issues which were already, I suppose, starting in relation to Ferro's work from a long while ago. And just starting to sort of thinking about the kind of building sites that Ferro was looking at, what he was seeing in Brazil, and how that might relate to histories, say, in the UK. So, for example, on the right is the Barbican Centre, this huge kind of concrete complex in the centre of the City of London, which was being built during the 1960s, but also the scene of great unrest and some very violent and sustained building workers' strikes as well. So Ferro's work starts to, I think, to point to other histories and stories that we haven't yet really been thinking about, especially not in architectural kind of history and understanding. Thinking about kind of the enormous amount of building, of homelessness and self-building initiatives in Brazil, for example, in contrast with the very tiny amount of self-building in the UK. So there is, and in fact, one of our researchers next week will introduce Walter Siegel's work with self-builders from sort of 1970s, 1980s. But these are tiny groups of self-builders, very often middle-class builders, using the technologies that he developed. So often not, really not exact parallels. Other sorts of questions that we're going to start, that we find ourselves asking in the, beyond the sort of Brazil context. And so this is very much, we organized in the UK with Central St. Martin's in October and November last year. We organized a lecture series, and this was very much at the heart of this lecture series, was what are the sort of questions that Ferro's work might raise in the UK context. How might we bring researchers together from Brazil with practitioners, activists in the UK context? And we held sort of 5, I don't know, debate sort of presentation sessions. Each one of them, actually, I should have brought them with me, but we also gave out a text each week from Sérgio Ferro's work. So there was kind of a poster for each week with an extract as well. So some lucky people took those away. They were very beautiful. So in the very first session, some familiar people and a familiar room. We've been in the room now. So we started off with thinking about the question of technical aid, and João, with Lara, talked about the work of Usina and its relationship to Sérgio Ferro's ideas. But also what was really special was this provided a context for really a very small group of people in the UK to start to come together to retrieve a history of technical aid in the UK. So again, in the 1980s, a small number of groups of architects who were starting to think that what was important was not to make designs for people, but to facilitate work with funding, with helping people to make buildings or adapt buildings for their users. And it's a kind of a tiny movement, but that history really hasn't been written. And we had a building contractor, an architect, and a couple of people who are researching this, all coming together really around this kind of discussion that João introduced. The second week, we had Mari Borrell from Arquitectura na Periferia with us in London, and we wanted to focus on the idea of enabling women to take part in the building process. So Mari sort of presented the work here, but that also allowed us to draw on some practices in the UK where women are building. So this was, for example, historical work from Christine Wall, who's looked at women during the First World War who built Waterloo Bridge, one of the main bridges that crosses the River Thames. And again, this history was almost kind of lost. There's a wonderful film online if you're interested. Just looking there too, we had, for example, Winnie Herbstein, who's someone who trains women in building trades, but has also set up a kind of activist women welders group called Slag Hammers. And if your English is very good, you'll know that that's a very witty name if you know what a slag is. Anyway, so this was a really interesting discussion for us. And Mari Mora also contributed to that with her research. We wanted to think about the really central question that Ferro raises, the question of separated design. And again, we brought in some architects in this case who really try to find alternatives to separated design, who try to find ways of challenging the division between those who make and those who design. So to some extent, we again look to practices in the past. So the work of Matrix, a feminist collective who were active in the 1980s and 1990s. Many of the group who were architects trained in the building trades as bricklayers, carpenters, tried to work with women builders, but also tried to find different ways of communicating and working with builders as well as with their user groups as well. And on the left, who's also a researcher in the project, was a contribution from Jane Hall, who's part of a British architectural practice called Assemble. And you can what's really central to their work is both being fabricators and working very closely with fabricators. So they share their workspace with all kinds of fabricators, and also as often as possible enjoy developing materials, components, technologies, and participating in the building work as well. So really interesting practice there too. There was a whole conversation about climate change that was really interesting as well, and the need for improved relations between builders and designers in order to start to build what we need in the UK, which is sort of passive house standard building that doesn't lose heat. We had a session on building alliances, which was really about unions. And I don't know if it's the same in Brazil, but groups like Peggy Dima's Architecture Lobby and many now new young people are starting kind of architecture unions and trying to unionize architects a bit to recognize their work as labor. And we also had a couple of looking kind of, again, to historical examples. And the question we really wanted to ask there is, does this kind of union activity, can this also build alliances with construction unions, with construction workers? So that was a really exciting conversation. And finally, and this is where Will, I'm going to hand over to Will in a moment, we close with this question of architectural education. So how do we begin to introduce into our teaching questions around the building site, around building labor? And together with CSM, we also asked a question about, started to think about climate change and how production studies and teaching which develops awareness around climate change and the climate emergency, what kind of common ground they might have. So I suppose those are some of the very live issues anyway, in terms of production studies that we've been talking about in the UK so far, as well as the kind of work that our affiliated researchers are doing. So I'm going to hand over to Will now to talk a bit about teaching.
Hello, and thank you. And thank you to João Marcos and Lara for hosting us. And good to see Carlos Martins and Kaya and Raisa here. We've been very happy to be here in the warm weather and very well fed. So I'm going to introduce a couple of classes that Katie and I have been co-teaching. Let me see if this goes the right way. Yeah. At Newcastle University. So the first, oh, interesting, it didn't update, maybe. There's interesting things going on. Are there? Okay, the formatting, so ignore the IT problems if there are any. The first was a linked research class that Katie and I taught together, and it was for master's students. We had 3, John Roberts, Anushka, Jumeja, and Zongshui, I'm forgetting his last name, Chang. Anyway, so these 3 students were kind of experimental audiences and agents for thinking through the problems of how to do architecture once you've encountered Sérgio Ferro. Once that critique, or when we presented them with the critique and asked them to think through it with us, to do something projective and analytical. And I'll show you a bit of sort of where we started and where they ended up. Backwards. So, well, this is where they ended up, but this is their final project. I don't know if this is a very British sign that you see on all construction sites saying, "Don't come in." And so we ignored that and we went in, or we tried to. Oh, sorry, yeah, again, it didn't. But so we started with the question of the construction hoarding. A hoarding is a fence or a screen put around the construction site. And we had a long conversation yesterday with Lara and João about what the word is in Portuguese. And the closest we came, tapume. So to think about this space that separates the city from the site. And Katie and I had sort of come up with this as a clever starting point, as a metaphor, but we hadn't really conceived of it as a full object for research. Our students, on the other hand, started looking everywhere. In India, I think this is Newcastle, this is maybe familiar, very, very British, London. Everywhere there are construction hoardings. We don't look at them, we don't notice how many there are, but once you start looking, you see them and you see the variety, and you see them as spaces in the city, not just empty voids waiting for a future city to come. So let me see if this, no, it didn't do any of my updates, sorry about that. So what they started to think was, what would a analysis of construction site hoardings, these spaces, look like if they treated them with the same seriousness as they treat architecture? And so they started doing a typology. This is from their final research output. And they obviously were inspired by a lot of Ferro's critiques of the separation of design. This was their full work process as they conceived it. And so they came up with characteristics of construction hoardings: half mesh, exterior, interior, aluminum, steel, timber. They tried to define all of the materials and forms that they found in the construction screens. And then they tried to make a typology of sites, a large building site, and what types of characteristics those sites might have. Spillover building site, ones that come into the city, not separated space, but have this different, more porous connection. Building site within a block, abandoned construction site. And then they took what I find very exciting about teaching architecture students is that they don't just do the analysis, then they want to do something themselves. And so they used the tools that they knew, model making and sort of creative outputs, to model the hoarding like they might a building, or of collage and diagramming, CNC little models. And then a kind of ironic proposition that children making things with Legos should also probably make sure that the health and safety is all set before they start doing anything. And then Zongshui had this idea of turning the screen into an active membrane where you could see sort of the inside is made outside. And then they also made these for our Central St. Martin's talk, which were little pieces of the building site, which they called unfolding the building site, which again was a kind of metaphor for the work that they were trying to do. What was interesting about the course, it lasted over 1 year. The first part was all looking at the construction site from the outside. And then the second, we took them to 3 or 4, in the end, sites in Newcastle. One of the reasons it was looking at it from the outside is it's very hard for architects to get into a construction site. So we worked on email, begging people, dissimulating a bit, to get ourselves into these sites and bring our students. And they brought, again, all the tools that they have as architects to think about construction sites. Some were very successful, some they understood failed. That their way of thinking about the construction site, for instance, in typologies, with these, they sort of tried to make a diagram, but it was so simplifying that they didn't really express what was important about each site. And I think by realizing that, they also understood that there are new capacities, new technologies, new ways of research that architects need to learn to understand the implications that Ferro's work and the work of production studies has for architecture, which is how do we capture everything that is going on socially, politically, and practically and intellectually as well. And it's not always through models or through the typologies or the ways that we tend to teach architects about design. So these are their sort of notes through the things. These are, I think this was Song Shui's, and that's the end of that one. The one Katie and I are teaching now is to undergrads. And the idea is that, so this is a dissertation, which is the last long, I don't know, 50 pages, 40 pages output for the undergraduate course in architecture, a large piece of individual research, original research. And in this, we're also introducing them to Ferro, and they choose their own direction within this. But what we want them to, the only real brief for instruction we give them is that it can't be about the building as finished product. It should be about the making of the building, the moments leading up to the individual, the eventual product. An interesting output is that a lot of the students were very interested in what's happening in the Emirates and Qatar, and particularly after the World Cup. I think that made some of the questions about the treatment of construction workers relevant to British audiences who want to watch the World Cup, but instead of seeing beautiful stadiums, are now made to think what were the conditions for the productions of these places. So this is a lot of words, but this is one student. No, it's perfect. I didn't make that many changes. Thanks. Yeah. So what he did, this is Ismail Ali, I think, was to ask not about the architect's relationship to the construction at the beginning, but rather the architect's continued relationship to the site. What does an architect do after the design? What happens next? Does an architect's job end? Another student was interested in the work of Wang Shu, which aesthetically shows the traces that Sergio Ferro talks about having been repressed in the smoothing out of the concrete and everything. And Wang Shu famously has a direct relationship with the workers on site. Other students looked at their own experiences of space and where they had been when something was under construction, and what does it mean for users to interact, to have delays and detours, and the future pushed ahead. And this was, I don't think we'll be able to show the video, but a student did a kind of interpretive talk with a pen that was very cute, talking about the experiences and the suffering of construction workers. No, that's just a shape I put in front of that. Yep. The next slide was actually the one. And I'll hand it back to Katie now, I think, and to, was this yours? I think, oh, that might have been, sorry.
This is just, oh yeah. This is more from this is from the students. Yeah.
Sorry, this is what we gave them to look at, how to think about separated design. The question about who builds your architecture, the group in New York who asks particularly about the Emirates and I think Dubai, Qatar, the relationships of South Asian construction workers brought there. And all these other questions that were raised at CSM about the experience of work for workers themselves, gender on the construction site. And now I'll hand it back over. Thank you.
Okay, so just so to finish, we just oh, the wrong one. Yeah, we'll just talk a little bit about our own research for this project. So all the researchers, including all the core team members, Lara, Raisa, Kaya, myself, Joao, are doing their own research project for this as well. Some of them will be published as booklets and also in a kind of edited collection as well. And that's what we'll be talking about next week when we meet in Sao Paulo. So yeah, do join us. That would be great. Okay, yes, and I suppose these are just some sort of an array of images from the affiliated researchers' projects, just kind of assembled together here. But I think especially I wanted to just draw attention to the opening up, I think, of questions around construction labor and the questions that Ferro opens to multiple kind of building cultures, not only multiple around the world, but also kind of maybe if Sergio sort of traces almost this kind of historical thread, which is almost quite in a quite conventional architectural history sense, because it's, you know, Gothic, Renaissance, sort of 19th century and so on, to modernism in Europe. Also just being aware that there are kind of multiple histories and multiple cultures. So that's one of the, I think, really exciting things about the research that's beginning. And I hope something that will expand when we open up the questions of production studies to a kind of, through a call for papers for 2024, for the conference in 2024. So yeah, so we're looking here at, well, Will's work we'll hear a bit more about up in the right in China, Megachand Inglis, who looks at Indian temple carvers who are producing carving, in fact, for Indian temples all over the world, not just in India. The image on the bottom right there is from Jane Hall from Assembly, who's looking at maker spaces in London. And yeah, and I'll talk a bit about my work. The way we've structured next week is to divide ourselves into groups around particular themes, shared themes that we have and interests. I'm curious to hear from Kaya how it's going with your group, but I think I struck lucky. I'm in a fantastic group, also and paired with Raisa. So we're pairing our research, and Raisa and I are both interested in building materials which are produced in the factory, so off the building site and produced in the factory. And I'm just going to say a bit about my project here. So I've been looking at for quite some time now, and in many different ways, at a moment, really, it's mostly in the 1920s and the 1930s in the UK, where we start to get building products on a massive scale. So the production of things like boilers, tiles, wall ties, all kinds of electric sort of installations, insulation, new types of insulation, roof coverings, just this kind of massive array of new building products. And it really happens quite suddenly and on an enormous scale. And I won't say very much about this right now, but in terms of thinking about the architect and the architect's role, this is really interesting, because at this point, the architect starts to name these building products, particular brands of the building products in the architectural specification. So they're a bit like a doctor deciding what pill to prescribe the patient. They're effectively making a sale on behalf of the manufacturer. Oh, sorry. So one of the things that I look at is how that changes both the role of the architect, but also puts them in a new relation with industry. So they become, I often say, product brokers on behalf of industry. And there are many close relationships that form at that period between component manufacturers and architects. We'll see a couple of examples anyway. And it's also something which is noted at the time. It's completely dropped out of architectural history of the period, but it was very much noted at the time that this was an enormous change. So why did it happen? One of the reasons, I think, is that this was a recession in Britain. It was a sort of economic crisis after the First World War, and the only buoyant industry was housing, the building of new housing. There was a housing shortage. There'd been no building during the First World War at all, and there were also soldiers coming back from war who were going to be angry if they didn't have a house. So there was a kind of a general feeling from the government that one of the really important things to do was to build housing on a massive scale, and that's private and social housing. So this is London County Council building estates all around London in the 1920s and 30s. And the one, we'll see a couple of images of Becontree, which was one of the largest, it was the largest estate to be built in Europe at the time, absolutely massive in the East End of London. So just giving you a sort of sense of the scale and type of housing. And of course, all of these buildings needed supply of materials. And these are some amazing images. So for Becontree, they built a whole pier into the River Thames in order that the building materials could arrive. Railway tracks were the first things that were put in place on the site so that they could deliver materials around the site. And I have some evidence that building sort of manufacturers, people relating to the building industry, were very, very aware of this boom in house building and that this was the business to get into. So this is Crittall, who was producing metal windows, writing, for example, just towards the end of the Second World War, the amazing, it needed little acumen, little brains to deduce that in the near future, building components would be in very great demand. So what Crittalls do is they start to standardize their metal window production in order that they can kind of introduce their metal windows into all these housing projects. And indeed, most of those LCC projects that we've seen have Crittall windows. So they found sort of massive outlet for their products. There is also sort of lots of examples of materials producers kind of changing their products towards the building materials industry. So, for example, this is Venesta or Luterma Ply, who were using timber from Finnish forests. And in the 19th century, making kind of hat boxes and suitcases and so on, and starting in the 1920s to turn their materials into building products, partitions and kind of veneers and so on for building. And very much, and this is typical, enlisting architects in the design of their stands and the designs of their publicity material. This is a whole other story, but engaging architects in the work of promoting their products. And of course, all of these building materials needed to be produced somewhere. And so factories emerge, for example, all around London, sort of in the suburbs of London, making these sorts of products. And we'll see the interiors of some of those on the right. This is for a company which was producing telephone cables. Later on, all sorts of other things, radios and so on. So they start with a site on the Thames. They move to Southgate on the outskirts of London, and another really huge factory in Hendon. Yeah, just a bit more evidence about this kind of eruption of factories in the area. I produced this a bit for Lara said, this will be lots of, undergraduate students who don't know anything about Ferro. So this is a bit like beginner's guide to why this is maybe important. But there are many ways in which we can think with Ferro about this change. But perhaps the major one is Ferro's important demonstration that the building industry remains a manufacturer, that it can't become entirely industrialized because it's so important to maintain this sort of source supply, constant supply of surplus value, of surplus labor. So what's kind of interesting, and of course he also looks at a series of technologies which are able to maintain, or, okay, so then the problem also being that if you retain skilled building labor, they can cooperate, they can strike, they can cause problems. So also this interest in the kinds of technologies which might alleviate those problems for capitalists. So we look at technologies and we look at this question of manufacture versus industry with Ferro. So how might we think about the emergence of the building products industry at this moment, sort of in Ferro's terms? And I think one thing is to recognize that this is a sort of almost like the invention of a whole additional set of building materials. And it's not replacing bricks or concrete and so on, but it's an extra series of products. And secondly, what appears to be really interesting as well is the introduction of a new labor force, and this is a female labor force. So women aren't working on the building site, but they are working in the building materials factories. And this is kind of this isn't easy to find out. So I'm still it's an ongoing thing, little clues, little moments where I can start to sort of establish this story. So this is the cables factory we saw on the River Thames, an American company actually. And you open up their boxes of photographs and it's full of women working in pretty much every area of production in the factory. This is a new find that I hope to do some archival research when I get back to the UK. This is a plumbing components factory in the north of England. And I found a sort of list of all the different families that have been involved in this company. And what becomes clear is it was sisters, mothers, wives, working in every area. So there are people making the molds for metal components. There are women sort of in every place really on the factory floor, not just in the office or the canteen. And I suppose then the question also becomes interesting, does that change anything? This vast entry of women into the workforce? And these are just some sort of beginning thoughts about what that might change. So this is at Southgate, which was a new factory built in the 30s for Standard Telephone Cables Company. This had sports grounds, canteens, and it's part of what's often recognized in the interest in the literature as a kind of feminization of the workplace, of making it attractive to women, something which was very dominant in the US, and this was a US company in the UK. So there's a sort of a change in the workplace in order to attract and keep women. There's also something which is really interesting, is that women weren't just working in the factories, they were kind of conduits for sales, often to women who were consuming these products. So you also get people who are being trained in quite technical work. This is somebody working in electrical training, teaching people how to use new electrical products, teaching women not to be afraid of electricity, and working in showrooms and so on. So also a whole really interesting field, I think, around women becoming sort of part of a sort of technical workforce. And also very much kind of involved in the sales of building materials. This is the Building Centre in London, which was something like a kind of department store environment in which building materials were not there for sale, but to provide information to architects and their clients. And this was run by an architect, someone who trained as an architect, Alma Dicker, who started sort of managing a single floor of the building and went on to be one of the designers of displays and the general manager as well. So you sort of start to find women in all kinds of areas. And I suppose the other thing about this is that it was a sort of almost like a feminized environment for selling or for conveying information about technical products. So I sort of want to argue really that there were multiple changes through this entry. And I suppose common in the histories and the thinking around the time is to think of women as consumers, but it's really important to think of them as producers as well. And I think to start to develop a sort of way of thinking about this emergence of building products in the period as something which reorganizes social relations at the time. So, yeah. Okay, over to Will. All right, thank you.
Do you remember the number of this?
97. 97. Yeah, perfect. Thanks. And I'll just finish up quickly with a little overview of the work that. Oh, is there? That one. I see. Thank you. Okay. Obrigado. Thank you. So the name of my project right now is China Constructs. And I spent 2 years in Xi'an, China, in the center of China, on construction sites with migrant workers and in architecture offices. And I think of this, and Kaya and Jose Tison and I have been in a group for this conference, and we've been talking a bit about sort of production studies and its relation to Ferro. And I think what Katie presented and what I presented are parts that sometimes Ferro doesn't talk about. I don't know in the writing that we've read how interested Ferro is in gender difference or racial difference or cultural difference. It's just not how he had set up his project. And I think it's a lot of the concerns of some of the people who are on the production studies work to look at those things that are now opened up to architecture because of Ferro's introduction of the question of architecture and construction and what architecture neglects. So my interest is, so I first think about China and architecture, which I think of as an encounter. China is a very interesting place right now. It's not simply post-colonial in a very, but it's also not just proto-imperial. China is building, it's bringing foreign architects to design for China, but it's doing it on their own terms in a large part. At the same time, this has created opportunities for global architects, and this opportunity is on the backs of migrant workers from the countryside, some hundreds of millions of mostly men who come into the cities. But then, because China is growing so fast, architecture and construction too is also a part of Chinese culture. This is, if anyone can recognize it, the water cube from the Olympics. This was on a construction site. This was a construction manager I saw, and I was immediately drawn to his shoes with, I think, a global fictional skyline, including the, as of then, not yet built CCTV tower. Construction also provides metaphors for Chinese contemporary culture. This is an all-women art group called, who called themselves, they were a rock group called the Baogongtao. which are the contractors. The Baogontou is this nouveau riche, lot of money, little class character who brings workers to a construction site. But it gave people a metaphor for the anxieties about wealth in incorrect places. And for, this is Han Bingbing, an artist who uses the backdrop of construction as a way of thinking about what's happening in China more generally, of destruction and risk and danger. So there's Xi'an. One of the things that was interesting was that I didn't go to Shanghai or Beijing, which is where most of the building for the past 30 years has been, but inland China, which made for a different sort of site. And so part of the work is about what is general to China, but some of it is very specific to Xi'an. This was the site I was on. And we were I worked there for a summer for about 3 months, and we were putting steel frames on the side of the building on a hanging cart on the side. That's the look down. This was the crew I was with. Just some pictures so you can see it. My shoe. I won't talk much about this, but one of the things was the danger that these men were put in, and there were reasons for that danger. The other pictures I had here were what made me comfortable, somewhat comfortable, going up on the side of a building, was I put my faith in the harness. But the problem was that the geometry of the building did not let them do all the work they needed to do while attached to the harness. So almost at least once a day, they would have to take off their harness to crawl along the side to insert a couple of screws. To them, it seemed like nothing. But obviously, yeah. Anyway, I can talk more about that. There's me. I lived with them in the dorm for an extended time, but I also went back to their villages. So one of the questions was sorry, I'm clicking too fast. What motivated them to take these jobs? And it wasn't as simple as money or need. It was the ambitions and the dreams that they had that were located back in their villages. And they were often building dreams themselves. They would use the money that they got from building in the city to build in the country. And I just love these because you see the difference of life and expression of their work in the cities and their work back home. So last, just a quick thing. I think the way that I try to understand the questions of the relationship of architecture and construction is that Marx talked about the relations of capital to labor at a very broad sort of perspective. Braverman and others looked at management to labor, the actual conflicts, mostly in factories. Design labor is another axis that it's like capital labor, it's like management labor, but there's also something specific about this relation that we can talk about. And so, as Ferro talks about, there's sort of architecture prior to building, and then there's this thing in the middle that's not architecture. Sorry, and then there's architecture, you get the idea. Architecture too. And that thing in the middle is usually not what we're interested in. But if we're interested in it, it brings in a lot of new questions, including about gender, including about race, including about culture and other forms of difference. Interestingly, the Chinese term "jianzhu" is does not distinguish between construction and architecture. So an architect will be a 建筑师, a construction worker will be a 建筑工. There's a different position, but it's within the same field. And I think that may be it. Oh, just some of the things that I look at, because construction has not been a topic for architecture, like Katie, in looking at the boxes, looking at these things that were not part of an existing narrative or story. You have to look at interesting new objects. And so these are construction manuals for safety from different points, 1959, 1960s, 1976, 1984, and the present. And through that, you see the changing depiction of the construction worker under Mao. The first thing that you have to do going on a construction site is to study Mao thought. And then the present depiction of construction workers as almost too stupid to do the job. It's a much more infantilized picture. So I think through that we can learn a lot about construction, a lot about China, a lot about architecture, and read them back and forth to each other. So thank you, and hand it back over. No, that's it. We're done with slides. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
As dúvidas, perguntas. Estamos aprendendo a diferencia entre los dos. Tratando. Tentando.
You can sit there.
Oh,
Take
okay.
the microphone. You're allowed
Let me
to.
just take my water too.
Yeah.
Questions? Doubts? Deixa eu ver se tem alguma coisa aqui. Para aqueles que estiverem assistindo de longe, quiserem algum comentário, pergunta. Clara.
Que aí o povo lá do YouTube ouve.
Well, first of all, thank you. Wonderful. As I speak English very bad, I will not do it. Queria perguntar para ambos, mas sobretudo para Kate, uma coisa que me intriga desde que comecei a acompanhar o trabalho de vocês, que é esse esforço com distintos resultados de introduzir o pensamento de Sérgio Ferro e a sua preocupação particular num ambiente acadêmico, num ambiente de pesquisa britânico. E a pergunta que me ocorre um pouco a partir da exposição da Kate, do histórico disso, diz respeito ao fato de que, até onde eu sei, acompanhei, um foco no trabalho da história da construção na França não é exclusiva do grupo do Sérgio Ferro. Eu penso, por exemplo, no trabalho do Antoine Picon, que vem desde os anos 90, organizando um grupo bastante significativo de intelectuais em torno do tema, enfim, da área. Hoje podemos considerar absolutamente constituída uma área de trabalho que é a história da construção. E isso me gerou a seguinte curiosidade. Não havia, desde os anos 90, um contato, um intercâmbio entre os ambientes intelectuais, culturais, britânico e franceses em relação a essa área? Assim, ou é algo mais recente? Sim, objetivamente, o trabalho de Picon e da sua equipe é um trabalho conhecido, divulgado no âmbito britânico desde os anos 90, sim ou não? Sim? E como vocês veem esse, por último, como vocês veem esse trabalho agora de vocês articulado a esse intercâmbio entre os ambientes francês e inglês?
This particular question about France and Britain, it's a really good question, and we did hope to have one or two researchers from the University of Grenoble. It's okay? Involved with the project. So there is some connection, but in fact, we don't yet have a strong communication. Yes, people know Antoine Picon's work, but I would say the main interest or the wider interest is work on engineering and then later on digital technologies. There are, I mean, I think you know Linda Clark. So there are also traditions in Britain thinking about building labour. And Linda organized these summer schools for a number of years, I think in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s. Bartlett International Summer Schools, which were really international. So it would be interesting to find out. We have the records of them. It would be interesting to find out if there were exchanges with France then. And I'm also, there was something else. And in fact, there was, some of these things are only coming to light now, though. So in a way, it's a kind of a history and a set of concerns which were in existence, but just have disappeared out of kind of architectural memory. So for example, in Britain, there was the new architecture movement, late 1970s, early 1980s, who were thinking very strongly about class, about building labor. A group like Matrix kind of came out of that because there wasn't really discussion about gender and started having the conversation about gender as well. But many of these discussions have just kind of have disappeared. So one of the things that's really amazing, I think, about the project is starting to kind of find, you know, this, we're not starting, you're quite right, we're not starting from scratch. And sometimes I don't think we know about those relationships. It'd be really good. We have to try and get some French researchers and perhaps some of the Desaint-Chantier lab to come to the conference in 2024. This would be really good. No.
So thank you very much for your conference. It was really great to know some experience about how to teach architecture after Ferro's critique. For us, it's really a challenge. And you gave us some really brilliant ideas. And I was wondering about the denomination production studies. And I think it's really interesting, but I would like to discuss with you the boundaries or frontiers between production studies and the production of urban space. It would be, I'm considering now the level, how can I say, the level of analysis of Henri Lefebvre about immediate production and global production. So maybe because my research, my current research projects more about the relations between immediate and global production. And it would be correct to do this distinction. So production studies, it rests on the dimension of the building side, the construction itself, or the building industry, and then the global, and the global
production of space, it would be the actors, the finance, the land, the rent, the property. So I would like to listen you about these questions. And also I was interested about the approach that you gave to bring together climate change and production studies. What are the references that you are using in your research or in your teaching experience about this? Because for us here, it's also a challenge to do this discussion, especially with the students. I know that's big issues,
Yes.
but I think it's so.
And maybe we should ask João Marcos, especially the first question as well. So in terms of the question around climate change, I think that if you're there on Tuesday, there will be some people that we can, and Rais's work is starting to touch, I think, really on the questions of extraction and the environment. And this was one of the really wonderful things about working with Central St. Martin's. I think it's a gap in our group of researchers. It's a space we're not really filling, and it's one we know we want to reach out and develop it more, I think. I think that's fair, yeah. So there's a sort of like, it's not something yet that we're really directly working on, but we can see that we need to be. So for example, we had Charlotte Malter-Bart. Do you know her? No. So she was talking in the last session. So her big thing is this moratorium on construction, so that, you know, in fact, what we need to do as architects really is to campaign to end building construction. So, and there were other groups. So Material Culture presented at Central St. Martin's as well, who are just looking at sustainable ways of making buildings, using materials, technologies, and so on. So I think we're just trying to start to build up a kind of networks and references as well. So that feels really, really fresh. It would be, I hope we pick it up in 2024. With the first one, we don't really have yet parameters for production studies, but finance, land, all of these questions come in. So land in your work, in many of the researchers' work, questions around finance, like in Julia Heslop's work, land and finance is the main part of her research. So it doesn't really seem possible to draw a line. And I guess, you know, nor can we sort of say this is just about the construction site. I think where the boundary are, I don't think we're clear. And I mean, for example, Matt Davis, who's in the core team, so Will's an anthropologist, Matt Davis is a political economist, and he's interested in, he thinks that, you know, his own international relations discipline needs production studies as well. And so we're not sure yet kind of where the boundaries end, but João may want to say more as well.
Acho que tem você agora ajudei. Tem uma coisa que assim, é campo muito vasto, né, muito amplo. Todas aquelas pequenas figuras, né, que a Kate mostrou, a gente tirou de cada um dos investigadores, né, tem gente pesquisando na Índia, tem gente pesquisando na África, tem gente pesquisando, né, em diversos lugares. E como é vasto, não só territorialmente, geograficamente, né, as abordagens, também, né, os assuntos, né? Então, esse aspecto, particularmente, é como se a gente estivesse num V0, né, e a gente, então, olha para uma determinada temática, um determinado assunto, e começa a dar vários passos atrás para ver onde que está na origem, né, aquilo que a gente tem que considerar de uma forma crítica a partir de uma visada pelos estudos de produção. Assim, é como se a gente estivesse tentando descobrir o que são os estudos de produção, fazendo estudos de produção. Assim, então, no caso específico, né, a relação entre o Lefebvre e o Sérgio Ferro, por exemplo, que é uma questão que o Pedro e a Mariana estão escrevendo sobre, né? Então, eles estão ensaiando, né, as possibilidades de interlocução, né, justamente, né, através da centralidade que o Harvey aponta, né, por exemplo, eu falei de Lefebvre como ponto final, mas é uma discussão do Sérgio com o Harvey, corrigindo aqui, né, do Sérgio Ferro com o Harvey, justamente por conta dessa centralidade do espaço na reprodução do valor, na valorização do valor. Então, é nesse sentido, né, de V0, de iniciar determinadas discussões que a gente está arranjando isso, né? Acho que exatamente se você notou, né, em determinados momentos, assim, na fala da Kate, né, que tinha, assim, olha, o Sérgio, né, quando ele fala tal coisa, ele abre uma janela aqui, né, para um tipo de abordagem que antes a gente não tinha atentado ou não tinha orientado a nossa pesquisa para isso. Acho que é um pouco esse o esforço, né, atual. Então, por exemplo, clima, né, que assim, são coisas que aparecem até em outras circunstâncias, né, até, vamos dizer assim, periféricas, né? A Rita Saramago, você conhece o trabalho dela, né, ela fez uma conjugação, né, de um texto do Sérgio, do História da Arquitetura Vista do Canteiro, né, juntou com o Concreto como Arma, né, para mostrar como que, né, a arquitetura sempre se fundamentou numa lógica extrativista perniciosa, né, para o planeta, né, da forma como isso se constitui, né? Então, acho que são iniciativas, né, são inícios, né, de conversas que estão sendo processadas aqui, e é um pouco esse horizonte que você vê, assim, tem muita gente, né, já são 30 e tantos estudos aqui que a gente está... Então, por exemplo, outra questão, as pedagogies, né? A forma como a gente está formulando a melhor pergunta a ser feita, né, para essa questão do ensino, da educação do arquiteto. E isso é dos ingleses, né? Eles falam educated. E assim, que tipo de arquitetura a gente quer educar os arquitetos, para os arquitetos fazerem, né? Que tipo de ensino, né, de que tipo de conteúdo, né, a gente propõe ou pensa, né, na perspectiva da produção, porque a gente não tem, que é o que a Kate estava mostrando, né, assim, entrando, ela, no caso dela específico, né, que ela tira o véu, né, que tem em frente à especificação dos materiais. Assim, a especificação a gente nunca levou em consideração, né, para fazer a história da arquitetura. Assim, a hora que você tira a cortina disso, você fala, nossa, cara, como esses caras determinam as coisas, né? É ótimo.
Bom, para a gente discutir, posso falar em português? Mais fácil. Sorry. Não, porque o que eu acho interessante desse trabalho que vocês vêm fazendo e nessa articulação mais ampla, porque eu vejo, por exemplo, os estudos da produção dentro de uma discussão mais ampla da produção do espaço urbano. Mas eu acho que tem uma especificidade, uma cara, que são os arquitetos e urbanistas, historiadores da arquitetura, interpretando trazendo economia política para essa leitura, que pode ser complementar à abordagem dos geógrafos que leem Lefebvre, Harvey, etc., na produção do espaço. Enfim, estou querendo aqui, acho interessante falar, olha, sim, tem a ver, por isso que a minha pergunta era, quais são as relações ou as fronteiras com essa discussão, porque eu acho importante demarcar também um olhar específico, obviamente que vão ter sempre relações com a produção do espaço urbano, mas eu acho que tem uma cara, o que vocês estão fazendo, que diferencia de uma abordagem lefebvriana ou mais dos geógrafos, dos economistas políticos mais preocupados com a economia, etc. Enfim, eu acho que seria muito interessante como caminho de pesquisa caminhar para isso. Olha, nós, enquanto historiadores da arquitetura, arquitetos, estamos olhando a partir, imprimindo esse olhar dentro de uma discussão mais ampla, que já é de uma tradição teórica, né, da produção do espaço urbano. Não sei, eu vejo como um ganho, porque é um olhar, por exemplo, como a pesquisa da Kate, né, de trazer as especificações dos componentes construtivos, o trabalho da mulher na fábrica de componentes construtivos, não é uma preocupação, né, para quem está lidando hoje, com a produção do espaço, a financiarização, etc. Você entende? É um pouco, tem um olhar específico que eu acho que é interessante de ser ressaltado.
Mas eu não...
If I can just add a little bit. What I think is interesting about production studies, so we've had a lot of discussion about the promise and the problems of production studies as a thing. One, it's studies, not practice. Two, it's production. What about reproduction? What about post-production? And I think one of the ways that we're thinking about it is production in its large sense. What's, to me, at least, the important part is that architecture has very specifically ignored its relation to construction. And so it's almost surprising that architecture would find it easier to talk about the production of regular people in public space as a form of architecture, but it can't talk about the construction worker as a participant in that because it's blocked itself. And so I think production studies wants to be about everything. It wants to be about the production of urban space, but there's a kind of glaring omission that we have to fix first. And so I think when you look at the design-labor relation as the first moment of connecting architecture back to a continuous, undivided production that goes all the way back to natural production processes, pre-human, through the human, through the materials, through the final labor process to the user, to all the external, it's my view, would all be production studies. But for instance, I don't think perhaps Lefebvre and de Certeau and a lot of people who talk about the production of urban space and the enactment that creates space substantively, they also don't necessarily talk about the labor of production. And so it's an interesting question. It's the same question that we have about climate change. And it's a problem for us that we don't know how to connect that. But we do think that it's a problem with climate change too, because you can't just fix one part of it without understanding a continuous line of production. And so we're here working on this little problem, but I think our vision for production studies would be much broader and would be able to have a new vocabulary that recuperates that material manual production moment within discussions of the urban production of space too.
Tem uma pergunta aqui, você pode... Yes. É da Beatriz.
Beatriz. Acho que eu tenho que falar. Beatrice.
Está escrito lá.
Ok. A Tris fez uma pergunta. Eu vou traduzir aqui, então, para Kate. O Will sabe ler em português, se vira ele, Will. Or Katie. Considering the debates that Sérgio Ferro, bring to us, they have a strong relation with analyze about capitalist production. Until which point these same aspects influentiate the studies of production in nowadays? Make sense? My translation, I don't know.
Acho que eu mesmo posso.
Ok, João.
É que... no fundo... a gente parte de um pressuposto, né, que é o mantra, né, do Sérgio. O Carlos sabe disso, e já discutiu isso bastante com ele. A arquitetura está dentro do campo da construção e a construção, por sua vez, dentro da economia política. É a defesa que ele faz, né, da inserção da arquitetura dentro de um campo mais amplo, que, por sua vez, está num campo maior ainda. Então, a gente parte desse pressuposto. Quando a gente chega no campo da economia política, a gente dá de cara com o velho Marx. É, né? Impossível a gente desviar, né, daí. Acho que, nesse sentido, né, a forma como o próprio Sérgio, né, defende, né, é uma atualização e uma leitura, né, própria que o Sérgio faz, né, do próprio Marx, que vem desde lá dos anos 60, enfim, dos grupos de leitura do Marx, né, de tentar fazer uma leitura, né, do Capital, né, a partir do ponto de vista da arquitetura e da produção da arquitetura. A questão do... Assim, o Sérgio, ele é muito enfático e ele insiste muito, né, de que a questão dele é o trabalho e o canteiro, né? E ele sempre dá uma desculpa, né, de que o Rodrigo é que tinha ficado com essa parte de discutir, né, a questão da terra, da financiarização, tal. Isso aqui, realmente, o Rodrigo ele começou, né, nesses estudos até falecer na Guiné-Bissau. Então, assim, ele insiste nisso sempre. Ele falou assim, eu fui para um lado da pesquisa, é uma divisão nossa de trabalho, né? Então, a ideia é cada um trabalhar numa direção aqui. Isso, eu estou reproduzindo uma fala do Sérgio aqui, não estou dando desculpa, né, para essa questão não aparecer. Júlio Gadelha.
Do we have in the UK this theme of construction?
So, translating Julio's question, are there in the architecture and urban planning faculties in the UK, do you have disciplines that approach those thematics, construction, labor, building site, and architecture design? All together, I imagine.
It's the altogether that's the...
Yeah.
I mean, I'll say really quickly, I think a lot of people talk about these things, but not in a systematic way. And that's what Ferro and hopefully production studies gives, is the connecting back between disparate, different disciplines. Like, obviously, economy, finance, construction management looks at construction workers in a certain way, in an instrumental way. I think architecture arguably looks at them in an instrumental way for the architectural project, not necessarily for the financial project. I think the idea of production studies is to define a vocabulary and a theory of how to look at them in a more, I don't know, organic, connected up to connect design studies to urban studies, to labor studies. And that when we look at construction workers' life experiences, we don't say that's a labor studies question. We say it's also a design question. But no, I don't think they necessarily exist in the way that we'd hope.
No, I was just going to add that, say, the work of Christine Wall and Linda Clark, one of the things that, although it looks at building labour and has been doing so in great and wonderful depth for decades now, it doesn't make the connection then back to architectural design. So it always feels distinctive that it's the connectedness or the contradiction of the relation of architectural design and building labour or construction work, which is just not there, even where sociologists or historians and so on are looking at building labour. And the other thing that I wanted to say is, one of the things I find really interesting, and I think it's happening to some extent in the work that's coming out of climate change. I think people are starting to think about the impacts of building, at least on people who are, for people involved. So, yeah. I think that's anyway, that's helping people sort of thinking about the kind of the cycle involved in building, extending the idea of the life of building. And that's actually a really big discussion now. There are lots of people doing really interesting materials research who are extending this kind of line. And the other thing I think that has been important is the interest in architects unionizing. And I think the understanding that what architects do is labor has meant a kind of at least a beginning of identity with other people who work. So I think there are some changes, but in terms of those kind of, yeah, I think this is much more developed in Brazil than it is in the UK, at least with the people we've met anyway.
Okay. Thank you for
Thank
your
you, and thank
speech
you, everybody.
Vamos?
Oi. So
Obrigado
very
a
much
todos,
for
obrigado
coming.
para quem está assistindo de longe,
Isso.
obrigado para quem veio
Tchau,
aqui
geral.
prestigiar. Muito obrigado. E obrigado por vocês.
Next week.